Winston Churchill paced his study in 1940, the summer sun doing little to warm the heavy clouds inside his mind. Britain had narrowly escaped Dunkirk, but the cost was staggering: men, tanks, and morale. The country teetered on the edge of collapse, and Europe seemed lost to the rising tide of Nazi power. Hitler's shadow stretched over the continent, and London itself could not escape its chill. The Prime Minister understood something many did not: Britain's survival rested on decisions that few others were willing to take. His cabinet debated endlessly, weighed options in hushed rooms, and yet indecision threatened to paralyze the nation. Every moment wasted was another victory for Hitler. Every hesitated order risked annihilation. Churchill, a man known for his stubborn genius, had a mind that thrived on pressure. He saw connections others missed, consequences others ignored, and opportunities others dismissed. Yet even he felt the gravity of this moment. A single misstep could mean not just his downfall but the end of Britain itself. Across the Channel, German forces prepared to strike. Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's planned invasion of Britain, hung like a sword over the nation. Its threat was immediate, formidable, and deadly. Intelligence reports flooded Churchill's office, each one hinting at disaster, each one pressing him toward a decision that would define history. He convened meetings with his military chiefs, pressing them for advice, weighing their calculations, and examining the very limits of possibility. Should Britain fight, retreat, or seek terms? Each option carried a cost measured not only in men but in the nation's soul. He knew that hedging or delaying was no longer possible. Churchill's intuition, honed by decades of politics, war, and writing, told him the answer was audacious. It was risky, almost reckless, and would shock both friends and enemies alike. Yet the stakes demanded courage, not caution. He would gamble on a decision that required faith in Britain, its people, and the sheer will to resist. In the quiet of his office, he lit a cigar and stared out the window. The Thames reflected a gray sky, the river of a nation's survival flowing steadily under the storm of war. He felt the enormity of the responsibility on his shoulders, a weight that would be remembered for generations. By nightfall, Churchill had resolved to act. Not cautiously, not defensively, but decisively. The decision he was about to make would determine whether Britain endured, whether freedom had a chance, or whether the world would succumb to tyranny. The gamble was real and the clock was ticking. Britain in 1940 was a country stretched thin. The Blitz had yet to come, but the skies were already tense with reconnaissance planes. Factories struggled to keep up with production. Soldiers were regrouping after the chaos of Dunkirk. And yet, beyond the statistics, the nation felt fragile, vulnerable, and exhausted. Churchill understood the psychological weight of his leadership. It was not enough to win battles on maps, he had to fight for the hearts of his people. Propaganda, speeches, and broadcasts became weapons as powerful as tanks or artillery. Every word mattered. Every pause carried meaning. Morale was a weapon and he wielded it relentlessly. The cabinet was divided. Some argued for negotiation, others for cautious defense. Chamberlain's legacy still lingered, a reminder of the dangers of appeasement. Churchill listened patiently but knew that delay would spell doom. Hitler did not wait, did not hesitate, and would not pause for indecision. Economic pressures added another layer of complexity. Britain's resources were limited, and support from allies was uncertain. Roosevelt's America was sympathetic but uncommitted. France had fallen, leaving Britain standing alone. Every decision was magnified by scarcity, every gamble intensified by the looming threat of total annihilation. Churchill himself carried a personal understanding of risk. He had gambled before, in politics, in war, in ideas that others dismissed as foolish. But this gamble was unlike any before. It was a bet not just with his career but with the survival of the nation. Every eye in the world would watch. Every enemy would strike at any sign of weakness. He visited military installations, inspected troops, and met with intelligence officers. He absorbed reports of troop movements, Luftwaffe plans, and the readiness of Britain's defenses. Each briefing fed the calculation forming in his mind. The risk was enormous, but the alternative, inaction, was far worse. The British people, largely unaware of the full scope of the danger, continued their lives under the shadow of war. Schools, markets, and offices persisted. Children played in the streets, air raid sirens occasionally wailing in the distance. Churchill knew that their future rested on a gamble few could even imagine. By the end of this week, Churchill had made up his mind. It was a bold, audacious, and singular decision, a move that could either save Britain or destroy it. The nation, and indeed the world, would hold its breath as he acted. Churchill had considered every option, every counsel, every risk. And then, in a moment of clarity, he chose the path that would define him. Britain would fight. Not partially. Not defensively. Not hoping for mercy. They would confront Hitler directly, standing alone if necessary, and resist until the end. This was no mere declaration of courage. It was a strategic gamble. Hitler expected Britain to waver. He expected fear to spread through the cabinet. By committing fully, Churchill defied these expectations. The decision was as much psychological as tactical. A statement that Britain would not bow, that Hitler had underestimated the resolve of a single island nation. The cabinet met late into the night. Churchill delivered his speech with unyielding intensity, describing not just the perils but the stakes of survival. Every word was chosen to inspire, to unite, and to compel action. For a moment, doubts lingered in the room, but his conviction was magnetic, contagious, and impossible to ignore. He ordered the military to prepare for total defense. Air and naval forces were mobilized, factories ramped production, and civil defense measures were expanded. Every citizen, every soldier, and every leader would be part of the gamble. This was total war, embraced as necessity, not choice. Churchill understood the risk of alienating allies. His communication with Roosevelt and others in the United States became vital. Britain could not stand entirely alone forever, yet the gamble depended on immediate action. Delay could unravel everything, leaving Hitler with an opportunity to strike decisively. Morale, he knew, would be tested relentlessly. Speeches, radio broadcasts, and visible acts of resilience were essential. Every citizen needed to believe that their prime minister was not merely a politician, but a leader willing to risk everything alongside them. Fear had to be transformed into determination. As preparations accelerated, Churchill rarely slept. Maps, reports, and telegrams filled his days and nights. He walked among generals and advisors, listening, questioning, calculating. Yet he remained unshakable in his belief. To gamble boldly was the only path to survival. By committing to fight, Churchill not only defined Britain's wartime strategy but also solidified his role as a leader who understood that sometimes the greatest victories require the highest risks. In the months that followed, Britain faced the Luftwaffe in the skies above southern England. The Battle of Britain tested every element of Churchill's gamble. The Prime Minister watched with hawk-like focus as pilots soared into combat, aware that each day of resistance bought Britain time and frustrated Hitler's plans. Londoners endured bombings with remarkable resilience, huddled in shelters while Churchill's speeches rallied the spirit above the destruction. "Never surrender," he declared repeatedly, not as rhetoric but as law of survival. His gamble depended as much on courage as it did on strategy. Churchill personally oversaw the allocation of resources to the Royal Air Force. Every squadron, every aircraft, and every pilot mattered. The stakes were clear. The failure of the RAF could mean invasion, occupation, and the collapse of Britain's independence. His gamble was visible to the world, a single nation holding out against a seemingly unstoppable force. The Prime Minister traveled across Britain, visiting military factories and airfields. He met workers and soldiers, listening to their fears and inspiring their resolve. He understood that leadership was both symbolic and practical, that the gamble required the active engagement of an entire nation. Meanwhile, intelligence reports suggested German plans were advancing. Hitler's frustration grew with every day Britain resisted. Churchill's gamble had forced the enemy to reconsider strategies, tie up resources, and confront unexpected resilience. Victory was not guaranteed, but the gamble had already shifted the balance psychologically. Churchill relied heavily on his inner circle, military advisors, ministers, and confidants, yet the weight of ultimate responsibility rested solely on him. No committee could decide the fate of Britain. No cabinet vote could substitute for the singular courage required. Through nights of reflection, he scribbled notes, considered contingencies, and anticipated enemy moves. Every moment of indecision could unravel his strategy. The Prime Minister knew that this was a test not only of Britain's military strength but of the resolve he had inspired. The gamble was clear: resist, endure, and inspire. Failure meant occupation. Success meant survival and hope. Churchill's vision was audacious, and it demanded unwavering confidence. By the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain had reached a critical point. The Luftwaffe bombed relentlessly, targeting airfields, factories, and cities. The British people, exhausted and fearful, looked to Churchill for leadership. Every decision he made, every order he issued, had the power to change the course of history. Churchill convened his military leaders at 10 Downing Street. The map of Britain spread across the table. The room was tense, each advisor aware that the decisions here would have immediate life-or-death consequences. Should they continue aggressive aerial defense, divert resources to radar stations, or prepare for a potential invasion? He weighed every variable. He knew the gamble was more than just a military maneuver, it was a national statement. Britain had committed to resist and there was no turning back. The nation, the world, and Hitler himself were watching. Success required not just strategy but resolve. Churchill walked the floor, speaking softly to some, sharply to others. His intensity filled the room. Every eye turned to him. Every voice grew quieter in his presence. The gamble was his and he embraced it fully, aware that hesitation could be catastrophic. Ultimately, he decided on bold, uncompromising defense. Fighter squadrons were deployed in aggressive formations, radar and intelligence were utilized to their maximum potential, and civilian efforts were coordinated to maintain morale. Every action was calibrated to maintain resistance and prevent invasion. The gamble required trust in his people, confidence in his military, and faith in the indomitable spirit of Britain. Churchill knew that the enemy expected fear, delay, and negotiation. Instead, he offered unyielding courage, strategic brilliance, and the resolve to fight against impossible odds. As he addressed the nation on the radio, his voice carried urgency, determination, and hope. Every sentence was crafted to inspire action, sustain morale, and communicate that Britain would not falter. His gamble was not just military, it was psychological, cultural, and existential. By the end of that critical day, Churchill had solidified his decision and set the stage for the defense that would become legendary. The gamble had begun, and Britain would endure in large part because one man had the vision to risk everything on a single decisive choice. The summer skies over England became a theater of fire and steel. Luftwaffe planes swarmed in coordinated attacks, targeting airfields, radar stations, and ports. The RAF scrambled, their pilots young, exhausted, but fiercely determined. Every sortie was a test of courage, skill, and strategy, and every day of resistance bought Britain precious time. Churchill watched the reports, each one filled with destruction, each one demanding more resilience. He understood that the gamble he had made required constant action, vigilance, and inspiration. It was not enough to fight in the skies, the nation had to believe in victory even when defeat seemed inevitable. Factories operated day and night. Workers produced aircraft, ammunition, and supplies at a frantic pace. Civilian volunteers dug trenches, manned observation posts, and endured air raids with remarkable composure. Churchill's gamble depended not only on pilots but on the collective effort of an entire nation mobilized against an existential threat. From 10 Downing Street, he coordinated with military advisors, tracking every Luftwaffe movement, every sortie of the RAF, and every potential weakness in Britain's defenses. His ability to synthesize information and make rapid, high-stakes decisions was unparalleled. Every delay, every hesitation could cost lives, or the nation itself. Churchill knew that morale would be as decisive as bullets. Speeches, radio addresses, and public appearances became weapons in their own right. "Never surrender," he declared, and his voice echoed across a nation that needed reassurance more than ever. His gamble depended on the people believing in the possibility of victory against overwhelming odds. Pilots were dying, airfields were burning, and cities were being bombed. Yet every loss strengthened resolve. Each act of bravery, each tactical success, and each narrow escape from destruction reinforced the gamble that Britain had chosen to stand alone. Even Hitler underestimated the British resolve. He had assumed fear would spread after Dunkirk, that Britain would seek terms or capitulate. Churchill's audacity forced the enemy to rethink, tying up planes, pilots, and resources in an aerial battle that was proving far more difficult than anticipated. By the end of the summer, it was clear that Churchill's gamble was paying off, at least for now. Britain remained unbroken, her skies contested, her people determined. But the stakes were still unimaginably high, and every day of survival was a continuation of the most daring gamble in history. Every morning brought new intelligence reports, new crises, and new choices for Churchill. Should he allocate fighters to defend London, or intercept bombers over industrial towns? Should he risk pilots in offensive sweeps, or conserve forces for the inevitable German invasion? Each decision carried life and death consequences. Churchill could not delegate these choices entirely. He was a leader whose instinct, experience, and understanding of human psychology allowed him to make decisions faster than any committee could. He weighed probabilities, risks, and potential outcomes with relentless intensity, aware that every wrong choice could unravel months of planning. The cabinet pressed him for reassurance. Ministers feared that the nation could collapse under the strain. Churchill responded with clarity and confidence, balancing the harsh realities of war with an unshakable belief in Britain's ability to endure. His gamble was not reckless, it was calculated, bold, and grounded in both strategy and intuition. As bombs rained down on cities, Churchill traveled to airfields to speak with pilots, offering encouragement, sharing insight, and witnessing firsthand the courage of those carrying his gamble into the skies. These visits bolstered morale and ensured he remained connected to the realities of the conflict. Churchill's gamble extended beyond Britain's borders. He communicated secretly with Roosevelt, pressing for aid, supplies, and moral support. America's involvement remained uncertain, but Churchill knew that maintaining hope of partnership was critical. His decision was a gamble not only with Germany but with the uncertain political landscape of the world. The nation looked to him as both strategist and symbol. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public opinion were tightly intertwined with his leadership. Every speech had to convey unyielding determination. Every action had to reflect confidence. The stakes were not only military but cultural, psychological, and existential. Churchill often walked alone late at night, reflecting on the enormity of his gamble. Each choice could mean life or death for thousands. Yet he never wavered. His mind processed probabilities, scenarios, and consequences with a relentless focus, driven by an understanding that some gambles must be taken to preserve freedom itself. By the time September arrived, Britain had survived wave after wave of attacks. Every decision Churchill had made, every risk he had embraced, had contributed to a fragile but growing sense that victory, however distant, was still possible. RAF pilots became the front line of Churchill's gamble. Young men flew missions that required split-second decisions under the most terrifying conditions. They faced enemy planes, flak, and the constant threat of being shot down behind enemy lines. Every successful sortie validated Churchill's decision to fight. Every loss underscored the stakes. On the ground, civilians endured the Blitz with extraordinary resilience. London streets were transformed into shelters and emergency centers. Factories produced aircraft, engines, and ammunition at breakneck pace. Every worker, soldier, and volunteer was part of the gamble, their collective efforts ensuring the survival of Britain. Churchill visited bombed neighborhoods, speaking with residents and officials. His presence was both reassurance and strategy, signaling that leadership was fully engaged with the realities of the conflict. The gamble was more than military, it was psychological. Britain had to resist not only enemy bombs but despair. In the war rooms beneath Whitehall, Churchill studied maps, plotted movements, and coordinated with intelligence officers. Radar reports, intercepted communications, and reconnaissance photographs became essential tools. Every choice, every allocation of resources, reinforced the audacity of his gamble. Despite successes, Hitler remained a constant threat. The Luftwaffe adapted, focusing attacks on cities, ports, and airfields. The pressure on the RAF grew exponentially and losses mounted. Every pilot lost was a reminder of the gamble's stakes, yet the alternative, capitulation, was unthinkable. Churchill inspired action beyond mere orders. His speeches infused hope, resolve, and determination into a nation under siege. Phrases like, "We shall never surrender," were not just words. They were commitments that galvanized resistance and communicated that failure was unacceptable. Even allies watched with skepticism. France had fallen, America remained cautious, and the rest of Europe was under occupation. Yet Britain's defiance challenged assumptions and shifted the war's psychological landscape. The gamble was working, but only because Churchill combined strategy with the courage to act decisively. By autumn, the Battle of Britain had reached a critical tipping point. Fighter command held its ground, radar systems functioned effectively, and the Luftwaffe was beginning to reconsider its campaign. The Prime Minister's gamble, though still far from complete, had given Britain a fighting chance. Churchill faced pressure from all directions. Within the cabinet, there were whispers of doubt. Military leaders debated priorities. Parliament demanded progress. The public feared invasion. And Hitler's forces pressed relentlessly. Every day brought new threats, new intelligence, and new moral challenges. He responded with both strategy and rhetoric. Every speech, every communiqué, every directive was carefully measured to maintain focus, inspire courage, and communicate that Britain had chosen a course of resistance. Indecision would have been fatal. Clarity became his most powerful weapon. Internationally, Churchill faced challenges in securing support. Roosevelt sympathized but could not commit troops. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand contributed forces, but resources were limited. Churchill's gamble extended across oceans. He had to ensure allies remained engaged, even when they were hesitant or preoccupied. Every failure, setback, and miscalculation carried enormous weight. Pilots died, factories suffered bombings, and civilians endured unimaginable hardships. Yet the gamble relied on persistence, endurance, and the belief that Britain could hold until victory became achievable. The enemy underestimated the effect of morale. Churchill understood that psychological warfare could be as decisive as planes or tanks. His speeches, his visits to bombed cities, and his personal attention to civilians transformed fear into determination. The gamble encompassed not only survival but the strength of spirit. Even in solitude, Churchill reflected on the consequences of his gamble. If Britain failed, Europe would fall entirely into Hitler's hands. If he succeeded, the war could be turned, alliances forged, and the tide eventually reversed. The stakes were unparalleled, the risk nearly unimaginable. He meticulously reviewed every report, weighing outcomes, considering contingencies, and anticipating enemy reactions. Each night, the Prime Minister's decisions affected thousands of lives, the nation's fate, and the course of history itself. By mid-September, the Luftwaffe faced exhaustion. Losses were mounting. The gamble Churchill had made, to fight, to resist, to gamble everything on a single decisive commitment, was beginning to tip in Britain's favor. The turning point arrived in the skies above southern England. RAF pilots intercepted waves of German bombers, using radar intelligence and superior tactics to gain the upper hand. Every victory in the air validated Churchill's audacious gamble, that Britain would not only survive but fight back effectively. Hitler, frustrated by unexpected resistance, shifted tactics, focusing on cities instead of airfields. While deadly, these attacks gave fighter command time to rebuild and reorganize. The gamble had bought the nation a precious reprieve, time to strengthen, adapt, and endure. Churchill's speeches reflected both realism and resolve. He acknowledged losses, praised heroism, and reminded the nation that perseverance was the only path forward. Britain had gambled on endurance, and every citizen, soldier, and pilot became a participant in the largest risk Churchill had ever taken. Across the country, factories worked tirelessly. Airfields repaired damaged planes, and civilians contributed however they could. Every act of resilience became a brick in the foundation of survival, supporting the Prime Minister's strategic gamble. International observers began to take note. Britain's defiance demonstrated that Hitler's expansion could be resisted. The psychological impact extended far beyond the English Channel, inspiring occupied nations and frustrating the Axis powers. Churchill's gamble was transforming global perception of the war. Churchill himself remained vigilant, refusing to relax even as victories accumulated. Intelligence, reconnaissance, and planning continued day and night. The gamble was far from over. Hitler had resources, ambition, and the capacity for unpredictable action. The courage of individual pilots and civilians became intertwined with Churchill's leadership. Every small success validated the decision to fight, reinforcing morale and ensuring that the gamble was not just strategic but existential. By the end of September, Britain had survived the critical phase of the Luftwaffe offensive. The gamble had paid off. The nation stood unbroken and resolute, thanks to the singular, decisive risk taken by its leader. As autumn progressed, Britain found itself in a precarious balance. Fighter command had weathered the worst of the Luftwaffe offensive, but resources were still strained, and the threat of invasion lingered. Every decision Churchill had made was still being tested in real time, and the consequences of miscalculation could be catastrophic. Churchill never underestimated the enemy. Intelligence reports indicated that Hitler was reconsidering strategies, frustrated by Britain's resilience. Churchill's gamble had forced the Germans to expend resources and rethink their invasion plans, giving the nation critical breathing space. The Prime Minister had calculated not just outcomes but psychology, both British and enemy. Despite successes, fear persisted. Air raids continued, bombs fell on industrial cities, and civilian life remained perilous. Churchill understood that survival alone was not enough. The nation needed hope, organization, and morale. His gamble was as much about inspiration as it was about military strategy. The Prime Minister maintained close contact with his generals, monitoring fighter deployment, RAF readiness, and coastal defenses. Every decision required meticulous planning, yet swift execution. Indecision could unravel months of preparation, and Churchill refused to let hesitation dictate fate. Even allies watched with skepticism. Roosevelt and American officials remained cautious, waiting to see if Britain could endure. Churchill's gamble extended beyond national borders. He needed not only survival but the credibility to secure future aid and maintain a position of strength in global negotiations. Meanwhile, pilots, soldiers, and civilians alike became symbols of the gamble. Their courage, resilience, and skill validated the Prime Minister's audacious choice. Each victory in the air, each act of endurance on the ground, became a reinforcement of Churchill's calculated risk. In private, Churchill reflected on the personal cost. Sleepless nights, constant pressure, and the weight of thousands of lives bore heavily on him. Yet the burden was tempered by clarity. Britain would survive because he had gambled everything when it mattered most. By late autumn, the tide of the Battle of Britain had subtly shifted. Hitler's plans to dominate the skies had faltered. The gamble had worked, for now, and the nation stood stronger than anyone, enemy included, had predicted. Churchill's gamble extended beyond air and sea. Subtle maneuvers in intelligence, diplomacy, and resource management became critical. He coordinated with MI6 and Bletchley Park codebreakers, understanding that information could be as lethal a weapon as a bomb. Every intercepted message, every decoded plan, fed into his strategic calculus. The Prime Minister also maintained relentless diplomatic effort. Maintaining ties with the United States was vital. Supplies, moral support, and the prospect of future military intervention were critical to Britain's survival. Churchill gambled on persuasion, using his skill and reputation to secure backing for a fight that would otherwise be impossible to sustain. Every day required the alignment of military, economic, and political factors. Aircraft production had to meet the demands of a relentless air war. Civilian defenses needed constant attention. Troop movements and logistics had to be flawless. The nation had no room for error, yet Churchill's gamble was calculated with extraordinary precision. Even within his cabinet, the Prime Minister faced dissent. Ministers feared the risks he had taken. Some questioned whether Britain could endure prolonged conflict. Churchill responded with unyielding conviction, reminding all that hedging would result in certain defeat. Courage, decisiveness, and risk were essential, and he had embraced all three. The RAF's victories in the skies became a testament to the effectiveness of his gamble. Each downed German plane represented a strategic and psychological triumph. Hitler's Luftwaffe was not invincible, and Britain's refusal to submit sent a clear message to the world. Churchill continued to visit troops, workers, and civilians, reinforcing morale and maintaining connection with those whose efforts made survival possible. His gamble required both leadership and visibility. A prime minister locked in his office could not inspire a nation under siege. Winter approached and the pressure intensified. Yet Britain held. Each successful defense strengthened confidence that the gamble, daring, risky, and unprecedented, was beginning to shape the course of history. By the end of the year, Churchill's gamble had proved its first decisive victory. Britain stood undefeated, morale intact, and Hitler's plans disrupted, a remarkable outcome born from a single, audacious decision. Churchill's gamble reverberated far beyond Britain. Neutral nations observed the island's resolve and reconsidered alliances. Occupied countries drew inspiration from the audacity of Britain's resistance. The psychological effects of his decision extended across Europe, challenging Hitler's image of invincibility. Across the Atlantic, American support began to grow. Roosevelt recognized the strategic importance of a Britain that could endure, and Churchill's gamble became the foundation for eventual aid. Lend-lease, diplomatic pressure, and logistical support were gradually mobilized, all contingent on Britain's demonstrated resilience. Within Europe, the German command recalibrated. Hitler had assumed Britain would capitulate after Dunkirk and initial bombings. Churchill's gamble had disrupted these assumptions. German resources were diverted, strategies reconsidered, and the Axis faced a resistance they had underestimated. The gamble also reinforced the importance of leadership in wartime. Churchill became a symbol of unwavering resolve, demonstrating that courage and decisiveness could shift the tides of conflict. His vision inspired both military and civilian populations to persevere under unimaginable pressure. Britain itself began to stabilize. Factories improved efficiency. Civil defense became more organized. Soldiers were better prepared for defense, and pilots grew more skilled through relentless training and engagement. The gamble had bought time, and Britain used it to strengthen its position. Even the citizens, enduring bombings and shortages, found hope in the Prime Minister's determination. Their trust in leadership translated into action. They worked harder, endured longer, and resisted despair, proving that Churchill's gamble relied on a fully mobilized society. The gamble was not yet over. Hitler remained a formidable threat, and victory was far from guaranteed. Yet the audacity of the decision had already changed the war's trajectory, influencing strategy, alliances, and morale on a global scale. Churchill, aware of the stakes, continued to press forward, unrelenting in his commitment to the gamble that had become Britain's lifeline. By 1941, the gamble began to bear broader fruit. The RAF had strengthened, the nation's defenses had been reorganized, and morale remained resilient. Churchill's commitment to total resistance had altered both strategic and psychological dimensions of the conflict. The risk had been enormous, but the rewards were clear. His gamble demonstrated that a small nation, under exceptional leadership, could resist a seemingly unstoppable force. It sent a message to allies and enemies alike. Britain was unbowed, unconquered, and capable of enduring beyond expectations. The Prime Minister continued to press for alliances and support, understanding that the gamble was not only about survival but about positioning Britain for future campaigns. He relied on foresight, intuition, and relentless calculation, knowing that every action now shaped the post-war world. Within Britain, the population had become participants in the gamble. Civilians, soldiers, and workers all understood that their courage, endurance, and commitment were essential to the nation's survival. Churchill's leadership was inseparable from the collective effort. The gamble also demanded personal sacrifice. Churchill rarely slept, wrote continuously, and carried the immense weight of responsibility without complaint. His health, relationships, and personal comfort were secondary to the nation's survival. This relentless dedication became part of the gamble itself. Hitler's plans continued to falter. The Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority prevented invasion. German morale and strategic assumptions were undermined, validating Churchill's risky decision to resist rather than seek negotiation or compromise. Even as setbacks occurred, Churchill adapted, recalibrating strategy and reinforcing the nation's readiness. The gamble was dynamic, requiring constant attention, ingenuity, and decisiveness. It was not a single act but a continuous process of calculated risk. By the end of 1941, the gamble had shifted history. Britain remained free, inspired allies, and disrupted Hitler's strategy. Churchill's audacious decision, taken under immense pressure and enormous uncertainty, had transformed both the immediate and long-term course of the war. In the years that followed, history recognized the magnitude of Churchill's gamble. His decision to resist, act decisively, and place everything on the line became emblematic of extraordinary leadership under pressure. Britain's survival had hinged on a single, bold commitment. Churchill's gamble demonstrated the power of courage, vision, and calculated risk. It showed that one leader willing to act decisively could alter the fate of a nation, challenge an empire, and inspire generations. The lesson extended far beyond war, influencing politics, leadership studies, and global strategy. The Battle of Britain and the audacious choice that preceded it became legendary. It proved that resilience, intelligence, and determination could overcome material disadvantage. It inspired nations, shaped the Allied strategy, and ultimately contributed to the defeat of the Axis powers. Even decades later, Churchill's gamble remains a study in high-stakes decision-making. Leaders examine his choices, historians analyze his intuition, and citizens marvel at his courage. The story serves as a reminder that extraordinary outcomes often require extraordinary risk. Within Britain, Churchill's gamble fostered a national spirit that endured through wartime hardships. Civilians, soldiers, and leaders alike internalized the belief that resilience and determination could shape destiny, even under overwhelming odds. Churchill himself reflected on the gamble with humility. He understood that success required not only his vision but the bravery and sacrifice of countless individuals who made his decision effective. Their courage validated the risk, turning a personal gamble into a national triumph. The legacy of that decision echoes through time. It reminds us that moments of crisis demand bold choices, that leadership requires action when hesitation could mean disaster, and that courage under pressure can change history. Ultimately, when Churchill gambled everything on a single decision, he did more than save Britain. He altered the course of the world. His audacity became immortal, proving that in the direst circumstances, boldness, conviction, and strategic insight can redefine fate itself.